In this video, we will review how to adjust exposure techniques. So here's our first example. An AP elbow exposure was taken using 64 kVp at 4 MAS, and the minimum kVp should be at least 74. How should the technique be adjusted for future exposures using the minimum kVp? Assume that the overall exposure was adequate. 64 kVp can be increased by 15%. So 64 times 15% is 9.6. 64 kVp plus 9.6 kVp equals 74 kVp, which brings us up to our minimum kVp. What did this increase in kVp do to the overall exposure if nothing else has changed? Hopefully you were able to recall that it increased the overall exposure by 100%, or it doubled the exposure. So what can we do next? We must balance the exposure. The overall exposure in this example was fine, just the technical factors needed to be manipulated. So we can compensate for the increase in kVp by decreasing the MAS. So let's take a quick look at what we already know. We know that an increase in 15% of kVp increases the exposure by 100%, or it doubles it. We know that an increase in 100% of mass increases the exposure by 100%. We know that a decrease in 15% of kVp decreases the exposure by 50%, or it halves it. We know that a decrease in 50% of the mass decreases the exposure by 50%, or halves it. So are you starting to see this relationship? An increase in 15% of kVp is the same as increasing the mass by 100%, and a decrease in kVp by 15% is the same as a decrease in the mass by 50%, or half. So what we can do to maintain the overall exposure is to increase the kVp by 15%, like we did, and decrease the mass by half, and that will keep our overall exposure the same. So like I said, we do this first by increasing the kVp from 64 kVp to 74 once we add that 15%. And then we need to decrease our mass by half, or 50%, so that our starting mass of 4 becomes 2 mass. The new technique is now 74 kVp at 2 mass, and this is the equivalent overall exposure to our starting technique of 64 kVp at 4 mass. And because we cut the mass in half, we also reduce the radiation exposure by half as well. So let's look at example 2. A starting technique of 91 kVp and 20 mass is used for an optimal AP abdomen scout image. Barium is introduced into the colon and another image must be taken. We know that barium is much more difficult to penetrate than bone and other tissue, so we know that we need to increase our kVp. We saw that 120 kVp is the minimum required kVp for a barium-filled colon from the chart we reviewed earlier. Assuming the overall exposure for the first exposure technique was good, we can modify our original technical factors for a barium-filled abdomen. So we take 91 kVp and add 15% of that, or 13.7 kVp, and our new kVp is 104.7 kVp. This still isn't at the minimum kVp, so we need to repeat this process and take our new kVp of 104.7 and add 15% to get 120.4, rounded to 120 kV. Note that I did not just add 30%, because that doesn't get you the same number. You have to do this process twice, adding 15% and then taking the resulting number and adding 15% again. Okay, so looking at the 120 kVp, is this an acceptable kVp setting according to the chart and the part being x-rayed? So we know that it is. The penetration is now acceptable for a barium-filled abdomen, but in this process, we've increased the overall exposure by double 2 times, or 200%. So is this acceptable? I hope you're thinking that it's not. So let's think about this some more. We've increased our penetration due to the high atomic number of the barium, which causes an increased attenuation or absorption of the X-ray beam. The surrounding structures remain the same. If we increase the overall exposure too much, the surrounding tissues will be overexposed. So how do we fix the overexposure of the surrounding tissues? So once again, in this example, we need to balance the exposure. We increase the exposure by 200% by increasing the kVp. If you are not a fan of percentages, we doubled the exposure and then we doubled it again. We need to lower the mass enough to decrease the exposure by 100% or decrease it by half and then decrease it by half again. So our starting MAS was 20 mass. We can decrease that by 50% by cutting the mass in half. So 20 mass minus 10 mass is 10 mass. We can further decrease by another 50% by decreasing the mass in half again, and so 10 mass minus 5 mass is 5 mass. So our new exposure is now 120 kVp at 5 mass. We increase the kVp and decrease the mass to balance the exposure. Continue to the next video to learn more about how to identify an optimal image.